Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Greg Plotkin, your host of Free Range Conversations with American Farmland Trust. Today we're talking federal farm policy, what to expect with the Biden administration taking office yesterday. So before we get into it, I introduce my guests. I just wanted to make a few opening comments. Now, I know the last few weeks have been crazy and there's a lot of mixed feelings in America right now, especially as it relates to politics. There's a lot of people that are maybe happy about the changes that are going on, others that maybe feel a little scared or anxious. And we definitely understand that at American Farmland Trust. But the thing that I think we can all agree on is that this is really a time of great change for the federal government. So yesterday, as I'm sure all of you know, Joe Biden was sworn into office as our nation's 46th president. At the same time, we had 3 new senators that were sworn into office. That's the 2 senators, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock in Georgia, and then Alex Padilla that's taking over Vice President Kamala Harris's Senate seat in California. That gives the Democrats a 50-50 split majority in the Senate. And then even in the House of Representatives, where the Democrat did retain control, there's a new ag committee chair. So a lot of changes going on in the federal government, a lot of changes going on as it relates to federal farm policy. And so that's why I'm so excited to have Tim Fink and Emily Liss with me today. They're our federal policy experts at AFT. And so thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
We were hoping that we were going to be able to have Chris Coffin, who directs our National Ag Land Network today, but she had some technical problems that didn't make it possible for her to join us. So Tim and Emily are going to kind of represent her in her stead. So Tim, any opening comments that you want to put out there?
No, I just want to reiterate that Chris Coffin's a very integral part of our federal policy team and a wonderful source, especially with the Agricultural Lands Network, on information about farmland protection specifically.
Great. So I just want to remind everyone that this is a live conversation, and one of the main reasons that we do this is so we can interact directly with our supporters. If you've got a question for Tim and Emily that you want them to answer, please just comment in the thread of the social media network that you're viewing this on, and we'll do our best to answer them on the call. So I think the first thing that I want to ask you, Tim and Emily, is what are the most immediate changes that we can expect to see from the Biden administration? What should people be on the look for in the first, few days, weeks, and months from this new administration?
Well, I think when you look at the messages that came from the campaign, on one hand, that's oftentimes seen as rhetoric, but you see a consistency between what was said as a part of the campaign and their plans, as well as what was done yesterday, in fact, in the form of executive orders. Mm-hmm. So some of the major themes for them obviously are attacking the pandemic. So you can expect to see a more robust federal response on that. Relief is going to continue to be a major issue, and that's something that they've already put together a plan for the Congress for Congress's consideration. You also can expect climate change to be a huge component of that, as well as racial equity. So just in fact, yesterday, there was an executive order on racial equity. I'm going to read it just because I want to make sure I get the wording right. Basically, they've directed every federal agency to undertake a baseline review of the state of equity within their agency and deliver an action plan within 200 days. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically an opportunity for every agency to say, what are we doing on this front presently? What do we aspire to do throughout this new administration? I'll let Emily speak a little bit more to the executive order related to climate.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So yesterday, President Biden, now that's exciting to say, President Biden began the process of rejoining the Paris Agreement. So there was a lot of talk about that several years ago when President Trump decided to pull the nation out of the agreement. And what I find really interesting about this is that the withdrawal process was actually very slow. And not a lot of people know this, but we didn't officially withdraw from the agreement until November 5th, 2020. So we've only been out of the agreement for about 2 months now. But since President Biden re-signed or will begin the re-signing process, we're actually expected to rejoin the agreement in 30 days, which is pretty exciting and really sends a strong signal not only to the country that we are going to be taking climate change very seriously, but also sends a pretty strong message to the rest of the world that, America is back in the climate game again.
And what do you think that means in terms of the administration's federal policy priorities, that there's this already initial signal on the first day that we're rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement? Is that, do you think, a signal that climate will be a big part of this administration's priorities as it relates, both to federal policy and other things?
I think there's absolutely no doubt that climate is going to be one of the major policy areas. And there's a lot of different ways in which that can be done. So AFT put together its own transition recommendations. We can speak more about that later. But one of the things that we identified was the potential for what we were calling a USDA-wide cover crop initiative. I'll let Emily speak to that specifically.
So as Tim said, this was one of, I think, 5 of our transition recommendations. And one of them was this focus on cover crops. Now, we had initially thought about having it be more of this broad regenerative agriculture focus. That's something that AFT talks about a lot, something that we really care about. And a regenerative ag focus would have been no-till, cover crops, agroforestry, all of those exciting practices. And we ended up deciding to focus on cover crops for a handful of reasons. Cover crops are very effective. There's a lot of data to support that they really do sequester carbon in the soil and sort of make climate improvements that way. Cover crops are really simple. A lot of people are already doing it. There's a lot of secondary environmental benefits for cover crops. So they make improvements to water quality, soil health. They help farmers both cope with drought on one end of the spectrum, but also flooding. And also cover crops, in the grand scheme of climate solutions, are actually pretty inexpensive. And then the other part about cover crops is that there's a huge opportunity. So cover crops have been, really growing in popularity over the last, 10 or 20 years. But even despite that gain in popularity, only about 6% of harvested annual cropland is covered in cover crops right now, meaning that there is a lot of room for improvement. So this was something that, again, we knew that the Biden administration was going to be very excited about climate, and we just wanted to give them an opportunity to really pursue that connection between climate and agriculture.
Thanks, Emily. And just reminding everyone, this conversation is live. If you've got questions about federal policy, federal farm policy you'd like to ask Tim and Emily, please just use the comment thread on the social network you're viewing this on, and we'll do our best to answer these questions on the call. We've got our first one that I wanted to put out to you guys from Rich on LinkedIn. He wants to know what will be different for people who work in ag on the ground. And he's got a comment here that this, seems like posturing. And I understand that. If you're a farmer, you want to know what differences you will feel as a producer on the ground. So I totally get this question. Tim, what do you think? What's the first thing that people who work in agriculture, what differences can they expect to see?
Well, I think with respect to some of those conservation title programs, like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program or Conservation Stewardship Program, you may see a greater focus on the climate change practices within those respective programs. Another component is actually at USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service staffing. So this is the department that does a lot of the conservation practices, and for years it's actually been understaffed. I think one of the basic priorities of the new administration is going to be restaffing that, and that should provide additional capacity on the ground. And of course, we would encourage the new administration, if they have these lofty ambitions for what to do on climate change, an important part is doing partnerships. And USDA NRCS is already doing some of these partnerships with other organizations, whether it be for technical assistance and other services. But that's something that you may see more of even in the future as they try to meet that need of getting more of those conservation practices on the ground.
And I'll throw something in there as well. Maybe this is jumping the gun to something we're going to talk about later. But something we've talked about a little bit is the possibility of growing carbon markets. And it's sort of hard to know where that is going to go, but there has been some talk about carbon markets. And And just that could potentially really give farmers a whole separate market to buy into. So, you're not only selling your commodity, you are also selling carbon credits. And hopefully that would have a really, really great impact, not only on climate, but also on farm viability.
In the discussion of the transition team, one of the key members of the agency review team, is what they called it, proposed this carbon bank concept where USDA would in fact purchase some of these carbon banks. One of the other interesting things about that, though, is that the USDA can also play a role in helping to standardize and sort of facilitate some of these private carbon markets. I think for those that are following agriculture, it feels like every month a different company is putting additional money forward for either carbon credits or just practices. But either way, USDA can play a role in helping to develop these markets.
Mm-hmm.
You're all this talk about cover crops has got the comment thread kind of going off right now. So I just want to put another question to you guys right now, if I can find it. It's from Susan. And just to boil this down, I think that she's really interested in how AFT can help craft policies that help farmers understand how to do cover cropping. Tim, do you want to start speaking to that?
Yeah, I mentioned one component is just making sure that USDA and NRCS is well staffed, that they have enough people on the ground to actually do this work. The second component is the types of partnerships that can be formed. So they can find organizations that have a history of doing some of this work on the ground and have them also assist in providing that. And of course, there's also more what they call third-party support, so technical service providers, working with people that are professionals in this area that may not be a part of a nonprofit or may not be a part of the government. They can also help to provide that information. One of the things that's important simultaneous to getting this on the ground is also doing the requisite research. In fact, I'll let Emily say a little bit more on the research component.
Yeah, so this is all stuff that we really talked about in our transition recommendation. And we really did acknowledge that, cover crop, it's not as simple as just telling farmers like, hey, maybe you should try planting cover crops. We know that it's much more complicated than that. And one of the things that we discussed was, we know that there are all these barriers in place right now to adopting cover crops. If it was easy, everybody would already be doing it. So clearly it's not easy. So we talked a lot about research into sort of cover crop related topics, like what are the best practices? What are the impacts? Also talking about creating markets for cover crop seeds. And also something we talk about a lot is the idea of double cropping. So actually being able to actually sell those cover crops as their own commodity. And then also just looking into what are some of the institutional barriers? Are farmers not able to access the equipment they need? Or what about the role that crop insurance plays? Crop insurance really dictates how a lot of farmers sort of plan their every move. And is crop insurance really this barrier to doing these practices that we want?
A lot of good questions coming in. Just to remind everyone, this is live. If you've got questions you want Tim and Emily to answer, please just use the comment thread on whatever platform you're viewing this on, and we'll get to as many as we can on this call. I think I want to put one more question to you guys before we move on. We've got one from our friend Kip in Connecticut. So it would be great to have NRCS recognize climate change as a natural resource concern on its own. Do we think that that is possible? Tim, take that one first, please.
That is an outstanding question. My understanding is I think that's in part Farm Bill and in part within NRCS's discretion. So the way that we approach the next Farm Bill can have greater concentration on specifically carbon sequestration or the climate component. Right now, when we look at a lot of the programs, they're using soil health, which is an important part, as sort of a term that catches not only developing more resilient soils, but also sequestering carbon. I think one way or the other, though, you're going to see greater focus on that. And one of the things we were talking about, what can USDA actually do, is they can speak to these issues. They can create initiatives that sort of pool various programs together towards a common aim, and they can actually specify goals. In ours, we say triple present cover crop acreage, but they can help to basically develop these focusing efforts for all of the different agencies at USDA to sort of take part in.
Emily, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think I do, no.
Okay, so I mean, we got a lot of good questions. I just want to ask one more. It's just because we have such excellent questions coming in. Thank you to everyone that's watching. So from Tomas, do you foresee an emboldening of CRP participation in access and benefits as a tool for carbon markets?
That's something I'd actually have to look more into. I know one thing that we've been kind of exploring is the role that CRP grasslands could have within this. We've talked a lot about cover crops so far, but we also need to acknowledge, of course, that is just one of a myriad of different types of carbon sequestering action. So an example is, if you use grazing lands, pasture lands, rotational grazing, those are the types of things. And so we'd be interested in exploring a little bit more sort of the CRP angle for this, because usually that's often been seen as taking lands out of production, but using it productively for carbon sequestration could be in the cards.
So we have a new administration as of today. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little about what programs or policies or even issues that maybe were off the table for the last 4 years is going to be something that is going to be a focus in the next 4 years.
We mentioned climate, and we've spoken quite a bit about that. Also, the diversity and equity issues. I think you're going to see USDA look deeply at some of that civil rights history and try to figure out ways in which they can reform what has been a fairly checkered past in terms of their civil rights process. With respect to some of the things that AFT has been particularly interested in, one of the points of emphasis has to be opening the doors to the next generation of farmers. So your average age of an agricultural landowner is 67 years old. And when we did the math, we found that 40% of agricultural land was likely to change hands in the next just 20 years. And that can either be a huge challenge, or it can be one of the biggest opportunities to change the face of agriculture. And so one of our recommendations was basically the creation of a farmland transition commission. This was something that was put into the 2018 Farm Bill. It's something that basically is a study to look at, okay, what are some of the greatest challenges facing this next generation of farmers? How do they access land? How are they going to be able to access capital? Understanding those problems so that we can look at the next farm bill with an eye of how do we actually address these effectively and open that door to participation. One of the things that we've specifically asked the new administration to do within the context of that commission is really look at what USDA calls socially disadvantaged farmers. So that could be women, it could be people of color, veterans are often included in that list, but we want a specific attention to BIPOC farmers within the context of that commission. What are the unique challenges they face, and how do we propose remedies on that? The other major bucket of recommendations that we have is farmland protection. One of the things that we see as an opportunity is that you can basically treat easements, or what we call non-development covenants. Those are more short-term, where an easement we often see as perpetual, but use them as a form of relief that also achieves other societal goals like farmland protection. We have something that we call a debt for working lands program that we're proposing to the new administration that would offer forgiveness on farm service agency loans in exchange for keeping their land in agriculture for either some time or perpetuity. Another piece of farmland protection for us is the government really leading the way when it comes to farmland protection. AFT was instrumental in the passage of something called the Farmland Protection Policy Act. This was in the 80s. And it's something that has never quite worked exactly as intended. It's meant to deter conversion of farmland from federally funded projects. Now, I chose those words carefully, federally funded projects. So that includes state projects. As if a state is putting together a highway and they accept federal funding, they have to report how much land is being converted. And right now, they're not actually reporting how much land has actually been converted. So there are all sorts of ways in which the new administration can reiterate their own role in farmland protection. And then I think the final piece on farmland protection is really trying to strengthen the federal government's flagship agricultural conservation easement program. also known as ASAP. That is our primary vehicle for protecting farmland. It leverages state dollars, sometimes one-to-one, whether that's a private donation, an organizational donation, or the donation from an individual farm owner. But what's great about that program is there's opportunities to make it work faster. And we also treat relief, again, when I mentioned the debt for working lands concept, treating conservation easements as a form of relief that builds back better. And that's the type of thing the Biden administration has been interested in.
We've got a lot of good comments coming in, so I wanted to put one to you. This is from Thule. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, on LinkedIn. Are there tax incentives that are being proposed, or you could foresee being proposed, that are going to help foster long-term farming, keeping farmers in agriculture?
I'm kind of curious which AFT staffer put Thule up to this question. We are always happy to talk about tax incentives, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's important to recognize that the way that the federal tax code works right now, all the incentives are stacked to a farmer basically transferring their land via their state. And from where we sit, that's not always the goal, because you may have the next generation underneath that farmer. They may have no interest in farming whatsoever, and that leaves that land more likely to potential conversion to development or what we've seen in the low density.
And also means that that land is just going to, transfer much more slowly. So let's say you retire from farming at age 60 or 65, if the incentive is to transfer the land through your estate, you might end up holding on to that land and not having it really be productive for, 20 years. So it just really slows down this whole process.
So one thing we were thinking about is capital gains. One of the reasons why farmers are tending to withhold their land for as long as possible and pass by their estate is so that they don't have to pay capital gains on it. This is just a financial decision that makes sense to them. But what we've been thinking about is actually adding a transfer incentive for farmers, whether they be new, beginning, socially disadvantaged, veteran farmers, and basically providing some relief on capital gains as an incentive for them to transfer that land during their lifetime, but also an incentive for them to also help to create new opportunities for that next generation. So tax policy is the type of thing that a lot of people think about, but could be really crucial in that 40% handover.
Absolutely. So we've got a lot of good comments coming in. Please keep them coming. If we can't get to them on the call, we're going to try and go into the comment threads of all these social networks and answer as many as we can. I do want to move on to one topic about future legislation. When we're thinking about, we do have a new president and kind of federal administration, but we also have a new Congress. So what legislation are you most excited about, or that AFT is kind of keeping tabs on?
I'm going to start with a dodge of your question. And it's not actually a dodge. It kind of goes to the broader expectations for the Congress. So as you noted in the setup to this conversation, you have a Senate that's literally going to be split 50-50 between the two parties. And that puts inherent limits on the amount of legislation that we can kind of expect to actually hit the floor. So one thing we should note is that you still have a filibuster in the Senate, which requires on most legislation that you have, assuming everyone's attending, you need 60 votes in order to get something to pass. There are ways to get around that. One that's been really pointed at a lot is something called reconciliation. Reconciliation allows you to pass certain legislation with only 51 votes. Now, it could be a 51-50 vote, because in this case, where the vice president, usually is someone who doesn't have a large role in Congress, they cast that deciding vote in the event of a tie.
Right.
So with reconciliation, you can pass legislation with just a simple majority. The catch being that reconciliation can only be used a few times. In addition to that, it has to be something that's budget relevant. And so there's real limits on what can be done there. But what that means is that instead of seeing a whole bunch of very small bills, you're likely to continue seeing very large pieces of legislation. And something that also needs to be worked out is a power sharing agreement. It may sound laughable that these two parties, after all of the bad feelings, would come together on a power sharing agreement. But the reason why they'd be interested in doing one is just the practicality of getting anything done in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have committees that are split with X amount of Republicans, X amount of Democrats, you could tie in a vote. And if you tie in a vote, you can't get your nominations through necessarily. You can't get legislation through. And so working across the aisle to establish sort of ways in which you can work together as a means of allowing more legislation to be considered is one of the most important things that we'll see moving forward. I'm going to pause for a second because that was a whole bunch of intense process, and I'll let Emily get in here, and then we could talk a little bit more about specific legislation we expect.
Yeah, so just two things I'll mention really quick. First of all, Tim was talking about reconciliation, Tim was talking about a power sharing agreement. And I just want to point out that there actually is precedent for this. So I believe it was in 2001, the Senate was also evenly split, 50-50. It only lasted for a couple of months, actually, before one senator kind of jumped camps. But there was this power sharing agreement in effect that did exactly what Tim was saying. So if a committee votes 50-50, it still moves forward. And it really just kept the Senate actually like moving instead of just stalling at every step. I also want to mention just that, we are obviously really excited about the new Congress. I have high hopes. Tim is maybe more cynical than I. But I also just want to say that, the Senate has a lot going on. The Senate is like one day into a new administration, and they already have 3 huge things on their to-do list. So the Senate already is worrying about, what's going to happen with the impeachment trial. They're also going to be doing a lot of work on nominations. And they also are presumably going to be working on a new relief bill. So the Senate's going to be really busy for a while. So we don't really expect any of the sort of exciting, more innovative ag stuff to be happening for a little while.
I think that's good information.
Yeah, I think the House is really going to hit the ground running, though, in a lot of different priorities, just because they have a different role in the process. Last year, we had the Agricultural Resilience Act that was put together by Representative Pengree from Maine. That is the closest thing to a comprehensive piece of legislation that you can have that merges, that really brings agriculture into that climate conversation. You have the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. They have their own set of agricultural climate recommendations, many of which echo what you saw in Pengree. And I think with respect to, there's a new chairman on the House side, a new Agriculture Committee chairman, Representative Scott from Georgia. He is very interested in making climate change likely one of the first hearings. And that is likely to translate into some legislation. I think one of the biggest questions coming up is the degree to which this conversation about relief connects with things like climate change. If you look at the Obama administration, their first major piece of legislation was, of course, the Recovery Act. The Recovery Act had a lot of reinvestment in things like climate change. In fact, it was probably the biggest investment in climate change we ever made. And that was within relief and recovery category, not necessarily a large climate bill.
So we've got a lot of good questions coming in right now. I think more than we're going to have time to answer on this call. But thank you to everyone that's paying attention, asking questions. Like I said, we'll go back into the social platforms and try and answer everything we can. I want to ask you guys a couple. There's a lot of questions that are coming in about next generation farmers. And so I'll just put this one up from Josh right now, that his ears are burning because we're talking about farmland protection. And I think the questions that I'm seeing come in through the thread are, what in terms of federal policy, what can we expect or what can we hope for in terms of policies or programs that'll actually help secure this land for the next generation to make it possible for them to, to be able to afford farming that land?
Yeah, we often treat easements as conservation easements as a means of helping to create opportunities for the next generation. One of the nice things is that obviously this involves selling or donating your development rights, but simultaneous to that, you're actually making the land more affordable for the next generation. And I think that in addition to what we can talk about in terms of protecting farmland, preventing it from federal conversion, is also just this idea of viability. I'm going to actually, Emily's done a wonderful synopsis of this. So you've talked a little bit about viability and how it relates to farmland protection.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that, at AFT, we really try to see the big picture. We try to see how all of these various farm issues, they're really interconnected. You can't talk about, climate in a little bucket over here and viability in a bucket over here and, land protection. They really all sort of reinforce each other. And I think what Tim is getting at is that, in order to make sure that farmland stays as farmland, we need to make sure that these are strong, viable businesses. If you have a business model that isn't working very well, or you are getting really low prices for your commodity, and a developer comes along and says, hey, I'll pay you $10 million for your land in cash, or maybe that's a ridiculous number, you're going to be really likely to just sell out and say, this business isn't working for me. I'll take my opportunity. And next thing you know, the land is condos or a supermarket or something. Versus if you have a really great business model, if you have a really viable operation, then you're not going to want to sell that land. It's not that this land gets paved over and you can't do anything about it. This land usually gets sold because these are not viable farms. So really finding ways to strengthen farm viability, whether that's by, creating new markets through a carbon bank, whether it's through, giving farms business technical assistance to make sure that they're up to date on their finances. There's really a lot of ways to go about this, but viability is really, really one of the biggest tools we have for making sure farms stay as farms.
Yeah, it's one of the things we always talk about at American Farmland Trust is one of the best ways to keep land in agriculture is making sure farms are profitable, right? If you're making money as a farmer, you're much more likely to be able to continue farming and pass that to the next generation than if you're struggling. Because one of the things we talked about on the last free range conversation with Jerry Cosgrove, our farm legacy director, is that for a lot of producers, their land is their 401k. They don't have a traditional retirement program that they can just tap into. It really is their land. So making sure farms are viable, I think you're right, is one of the key ways to make sure we can transfer that to the next generation. Before we go in and talk about our transition recommendations, I want to just put a couple more questions to you guys. One of them is about ecosystem services markets. And so when we're talking about ecosystem services, we're talking about the ancillary benefits that farming done right can provide. So clean water, clean air, healthy soils, things like that. And these markets would actually compensate farmers for those benefits in addition to whatever farm products they can produce on their land. And so Tim or Emily, how close are we to these markets being a reality for farmers?
This, it's tough to say. Is actually a very, very good question. I think we're closer than ever to it, and for a variety of reasons. So, we spent years talking about agriculture and climate change, and all of a sudden you have a lot of different organizations coming to the table who haven't been at the table before. So recently in December, I think, was the coming out of what was the Farm and Agriculture Food Alliance. Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, actually, I'll make sure I get that right. And that included Farm Bureau. And they had a series of recommendations, one of which was, coming out in favor of the carbon market and the favor of ecosystem services. So you have farm groups that have traditionally not been as attentive to these issues, suddenly seeing this as an opportunity to contribute to the viability of their operation. So you have it on the organizational front. You also have an administration that's been very interested already in trying to advance these issues and these practices. You have private companies, whether it be Indigo Ag, General Mills, all sorts of different companies right now are coming out in favor of these types of payments and opportunities for, and what I like about what the question was it talked about ecosystem services. I fall in the trap often of talking about carbon sequestration. And when we solely talk about carbon sequestration, we're losing sight of all the water quality benefits that we also need to make sure that we're providing compensation for. I think we have folks at AFT that have been much closer to the ecosystem services market, that if someone's really interested, I'd happy to connect connect them with that. I think one of the biggest challenges has just been the chicken and egg on demand versus supply. And so finding people that would be buyers for these ecosystem services. And I think with some of the private companies, you're seeing a little bit more on the buy front. And then if you can have USDA have a role in sort of pushing this right over the hump, creating some basic, establishing or setting minimum standards for some of these markets, and even playing a role in defining some of the science on whether it be, monitoring, verification, transfer aspects. There's a lot of different enabling things that can happen, but if there is demand, there will be supply.
Yeah, I just want to throw in there as well that I would say that one of the barriers really is that monitoring and quantification and verification, and you see that in carbon markets as well. That we know that these practices sequester carbon, but it's challenging to know the precise quantity, and without quantities, it's hard to make that translate into credits. And I think we'll sort of have the same challenge when we talk about ecosystem service payments. So I think that's one of the major barriers that we'll have to deal with.
And there was legislation last year that came out, which was bipartisan, and that came from the Senate Ag Committee. It was called the Growing Climate Solutions Act.
I believe it was bicameral too, wasn't it?
Yes, because they had a House version as well. And so even in a fairly divided Senate, you could actually see some of that legislation come to fruition that's trying to get USDA a little bit more engaged in carbon markets.
So ton of interest in ecosystem services markets in the comment thread right now. It's really kind of incredible. So we'll flash Tim and Emily's contact information on the screen now. And I just encourage people that are interested in these issues to get in touch with them. And they can direct you to the right people at AFT or the right resources to learn more. I do want to talk about our transition recommendations. It's very important, but we have so many good questions. I just want to put one more. This is from Will O'Mara on YouTube. So he's talking about the COVID-induced spikes we're seeing in real estate markets, outside of New York City, outside of San Francisco, and in many parts of the country. Is there a way to give easements more teeth at the federal level to ensure that land is sold for active agriculture?
This is something that I believe came up in the conversation with Jerry Cosgrove. So when we did our Farms Under Threat study, I think it ran to pre-COVID. So the data we had showed substantial conversion of agricultural land. I don't think we have data at this exact moment at the degree to which COVID in particular has been accelerated that conversion of land. But as Jerry noted last week in the live stream, that we're hearing anecdotes all the time about how people are now moving out of the cities and getting engaged. In terms of whether the easements could get stronger teeth, I think I'd have to know a little bit more about what's actually causing it. The perception I've had is that this is private people buying private land, and that's not necessarily a situation where land that is eased is suddenly being sold or converted. I could be wrong about that, so I need to learn more about that. But I think that there's a lot of state policy, and I think I'd refer to our Farms Under Threat State of the States report for all the things. And this isn't just a federal issue. I've mentioned things like farmland protection. We've mentioned things like farm viability. But there's a host of policies and planning that states can do in local government. Local government, for instance, can do zoning, and they can be much more intentional about driving growth away from the agricultural land. Or we've also seen things like agricultural districts, which can work a variety of ways, but providing some sort of incentives to keep that land in agriculture, if those are tax incentives, if they're infrastructure incentives. So there's a lot of different contributors that can help prevent that, even beyond just trying to take the easement route, which we'll always see as an important part of this conversation.
Running low on time, we still have great questions coming in, and there is going to be time for a few more. So if you've got anything you want Tim and Emily to talk about in terms of federal farm policy, please use the comment thread on the platform that you're viewing this on. We'll try and get to it. But in the short amount of time we do have left, I'd love to move to AFT's transition recommendations. So we'll flash the URL on the screen here. It's farmland.org/transition2021 for people that want to check out all the recommendations in detail. But Tim, tell us a little bit about, give us kind of the high level of what AFT is kind of really focused on.
Yeah, and we've actually touched upon a lot of these transition recommendations as part of this conversation. So there's 5 major recommendations. Emily spoke to the USDA-wide cover crop initiative. And what's nice about that transition recommendations that's being flashed there is we have a 2-pager that briefly summarizes our recommendations, each of which leads to a longer white paper about those 5 recommendations. So you can look and get as short of an explanation or as long an explanation as you'd like. The other recommendations, Farmland Transition Commission, that's the type of thing that administration can do very, very rapidly. And in fact, it's imperative that they do that rapidly so that we can have those results to shape the next Farm Bill conversation. Farmland protection, I mentioned maximizing ASAP, connecting that agricultural conservation easement program, connecting it, using it as a bridge to additional conservation. So prioritizing the people in that program for other conservation programs. We had the debt for working lands, the debt forgiveness aspect, as well as strengthening that Farmland Protection Policy Act.
Lots of good transition recommendations. Emily, anything else you want to just, I don't know, highlight for the people watching in terms of the recommendations that we're going to be focused on?
I think that was sort of the overview. Tim, did you already give like our caveats for the transition recommendations?
I believe so, but it never hurts to mention it. So
I think that the intro we like to give for the transition recommendations is that, you know, we were writing these recommendations in October, so we really didn't know which administration we were writing them for. We also had no idea what Congress was going to look like. So we really, you know, we could have done a million recommendations for a million different things, you know, and we ended up on these 5 because we thought that these 5 were the ones that the administration could push forward without Congress having to be involved. So that's why we ended up with what we got.
Yes, thanks for pointing that out. Couple more questions we've got time for before we wrap up. One of these is from one of our colleagues, Brian. I don't know what a 2032A is as it relates to agricultural conservation easements, but I assume you guys do. So is this fix something that's on AFT's radar?
There are multiple quote unquote fixes to be done with 2032A. I'm going to do my best to explain it, but there are people that do taxes at AFT that can explain it much better. 2032A is a tax provision that essentially allows you to get an exclusion, I believe, from the estate tax under the condition that when you transfer the land remains in agriculture for the next 10 years. So there are a few different challenges with this 2032A provision. First, it hasn't actually kept up with the actual cost of farmland. And so the exclusion, if that's the right term, and others will certainly correct me, is just hasn't kept pace with sort of the reality. And so therefore, it's not working as effectively as we want. The other challenge with 32A is that if someone then takes advantage of it, they're like, I'm going to keep this land in agriculture for 10 years, and then they donate a conservation easement, that can actually violate the terms of their 2032A use. And then they all of a sudden have to pay back some of the financial benefits that were accrued by taking advantage of that tax provision. And so we need to make sure it's just an accident that this happened, because obviously 2032A was designed to keep land in agriculture. No better way to do that than really to go with a conservation easement. So that's another thing we'll be looking to remedy. And I think we could see more attention to tax issues in general within the new Congress. And that creates openings for conversations about 2032A, in addition to some of the incentives for transfer of land that we spoke of earlier.
So we're almost out of time here. This has been a really fabulous conversation. I want to thank everyone that has tuned in and watched, and for all the great questions that have come in. But I also want to thank everyone for engaging with each other. I'm noticing that a lot of people are talking to each other, answering each other's questions, and I just think that's really great to see. I love that we're we have this community at AFT of people that are interested in these federal policy issues that can talk and educate each other. Tim and Emily, any final words on the topic of federal farm policy and what people can expect in the next 4 years before we wrap it up?
I think the big thing is really this notion of building back better. When we look at what happened with the pandemic, we realize, yes, it created new problems, but in many ways it just put in stark relief a lot of the challenges we already have in agriculture. And so treating this moment not just as an opportunity to restore what we have, but to make something much better, much more open and much more inclusive, that is a huge opportunity that lies before us. And that's the type of thing that's going to be extremely relevant as we move forward. And we see AFT as having a pivotal voice in that conversation.
Emily, final thoughts?
Sort of just echoing what Tim said. I think that, I think we're just really excited to just see some exciting new legislation going on, whether it's regarding COVID relief and, as Tim said, sort of building back better. I think I'm really excited about just, having climate change finally be back on the table. And I think we're really looking forward to seeing some new legislation there. And again, hopefully, building more of those connections between viability and relief and climate and ecosystem services. And again, just saying that these are not disparate issues. These really do all reinforce each other. And just, I hope we can explore that more moving forward.
And it really all comes back to keeping land in agriculture, right? That's the goal here, protecting farmland from development, keeping it viable for future generations. And so I think it's important to talk about all of these issues as interrelated, as Emily said. So Tim and Emily, I just really appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us today. We've got some great live free-range conversations coming up in February, March, and April. We're going to have our Midwest team. We're going to have our California team. We're going to be talking Farmers Combat Climate Change around Earth Day. So please tune in for those. We'll get information out as soon as those conversations are scheduled. And everyone, again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.